Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to review Season 2 of Star Trek TNG and pick out my favorite episodes, so let's get started. And the first episode is called The Child, which is about yet another energy alien that comes into the Enterprise and then goes into Troy and becomes an embryo and is born as the child of Troy, who is actually an alien but seems to be kind of unaware of it at first. And this idea was done in a lot of other science fiction shows and movies, and it's an obvious metaphor to the virgin birth of Jesus. And one of the things that Star Trek often did is kind of show that maybe religion or various gods in history were actually aliens, and so I think that's the same kind of idea here, to show that maybe a virgin birth was actually the result of alien interferences. So it's like a Jesus metaphor, and even in the end of the episode, when the whole ship is in danger because some virus is about to get loose, then that child sacrifices himself in order to save the ship, and then ascends back into the spirit realm, again into an energy alien, and then leaves the ship. So I think it's kind of a Jesus metaphor. And this episode also introduced Dr. Pulaski, who a lot of Trekkies hate. I don't actually hate her. I think in some ways maybe she's even more interesting than Dr. Crusher, who was never really properly developed in any episode, and she was obviously a better eye candy than Pulaski. But other than that, she wasn't really better in any way. So I actually think Pulaski is a more interesting character. And I think also one of the reasons people kind of disliked her is that they made her kind of annoying on purpose. She was written as an annoying character, especially toward Data. She was always kind of demeaning Data, saying that Data is not really a person, he's a machine and all of that. But I think the intention was that later on, when she gets to know Data, then she would change her mind about it. And because she left the show after the seasons, they never really did that, and so she kind of remained that annoying doctor who didn't treat Data right. But I think she had potential to be a much more interesting character. And so I never really hated Pulaski. Also, Riker has a beard now, and his personality becomes more interesting. Like in the first season, Riker was a very boring, bland character. He had no real personality traits, and only from this season onwards, suddenly he becomes like a real person. Also, his body language became more interesting, like the way he talks, the way he sits, the way he walks out of a scene, kind of shaking his head, all those little mannerisms of Riker started to appear from this season. And I think part of the reason is that the actor simply became much more relaxed in the role. He wasn't as tense and stiff as he was in season 1, and so it really improved the character in my opinion. The character started developing a personality, and it made him much more charismatic and likable. Also, Worf as security chief I think is an improvement over Tasha Yar. I talked about that in my previous review. And LaForge got promoted to chief engineer, which also I think is more interesting because this way we don't just see the bridge all the time, we see some other kind of room once in a while, just like Scotty in the original series was in engineering. So here it's LaForge, and he still comes with them on away missions and all of that, so he's still a normal character, a main character as before, only that he's not always on the bridge, even though he often comes up there anyway. But at least we have a character who is growing, a character who is evolving, who is promoted, who rises in ranks, who changes position, which is a good thing. I wish more characters would get developed that way throughout the show, because for the most part, the way everything is now in season 2, that's pretty much the way it will be up until the end of the series, with the exception of the Doctor being replaced again by Beverly, and Wesley later leaving in season 4, and then Ensign Rowe coming in. But other than that, all the other characters stay in the exact same position and exactly the same as they are now. But on the other hand, they are each in their perfect spot. So anyway, about this episode, so we are introduced to Dr. Pulaski. We see Troy giving birth and then raising her child in a few days. He grows up fast. There was a science mistake in this episode when Pulaski said that the child has exactly Troy's DNA, and yet the child is a boy and not a girl. So if he has her exact DNA, wouldn't it be a clone of Troy? So shouldn't it be a girl? And so that doesn't really make sense, unless we consider that because Troy is an alien, maybe things are different for betazoids. Maybe boys and girls do have the same exact genes, and what determines if it's a boy or a girl if some other gene gets activated. So I can make up excuses because she's an alien, so I think it's fine. They also mentioned that betazoid pregnancy lasts 10 months and not 9 months, maybe because they have more developed brains, because they have telepathy. Also, the child seems to have telepathy right away, even though in the next season, I think in one episode, it was mentioned that they only developed those powers as a teenager, not from childhood. So that's a little bit of a contradiction, but because it's an alien, we can say that, it speeds up everything, so maybe its brain got developed faster than the rest of his body, so I'm fine with this mistake. I love pointing out mistakes, but I also like inventing explanations, and if a mistake has an easy excuse for it, which makes sense, then I don't really get bothered by a mistake like that. Also, this episode introduced Ten Forward and Guinan, and I think Guinan was a good character. They only made her appear when they had something to give her to do, so she always had some clever dialogue, some very interesting advice. In many ways, she's much better than Troy with the advice she gives to the crew. Troy was a lot of times, because she's a regular character and it's hard to write smart writing all the time, so a lot of times Troy was not really that useful, but Guinan only appears once in a while, and she only appears when they have some good dialogue for her. So I think Guinan was a good character. So this episode had a lot of scenes for a lot of good stuff, but the plot of this episode is not really that impressive, so it's just an okay episode, slightly below average in my opinion. So let's move to the next one, which is called Where Silence Has Liz, and I think it's a great episode. It has that creepy mystery thing going on, which, as I always say, that's one of the things that make me love the show, especially the first viewing of it was so awesome when you don't know what's going on, and you're on the edge of your seat, you want to find out what's happening, and so this is this kind of episode. So they encounter a hole in space, they accidentally go into it, and then they find themselves in some other dimension, and then they see a different starship, and they go on board it, and then Riker and Worf get trapped in those loops, spatial loops and all that stuff. That's really cool visually, that's interesting, and it's all kind of creepy. Then they find out they're inside some kind of laboratory, being tested on by a more advanced alien. So that's a neat idea, that's a fun idea, just as a science fiction concept, and it was done pretty well visually, and it was creepy and exciting. So I think it's a higher than average episode. It even had those Star Trek-y speeches in the end when the alien kind of criticizes humanity, even though that alien is totally hypocritical because he didn't behave any better than the humanity that he's criticizing. But still, I love those little digs at humanity because it's true, So I love the Star Trek for criticizing the bad things in humanity, and so it had that element as well. So overall, a very good episode, one of the best in my opinion of season 2. And let's now move to the next one, which is called Elementary Dear Data, which is yet another holodeck episode. However, this one is better than the average holodeck episode, which I complained about in my previous review. I said that it's not really interesting to have a whole episode set in the holodeck compared to actually going to a planet or to the past, because those stories would have some consequence, it would have some kind of morality issue to solve or to talk about concerning that whole planet. But if it's all inside the holodeck and it's all just disappears in the end, then it doesn't really have any meaning. However, the difference in this episode is because we are introduced to a character in the holodeck who actually becomes sentient, and he's not gone by the end. They save him and he reappears later in the show in another episode. So therefore this episode does have consequences, and it does raise some kind of a morality question of what to do with this sentient holographic being who is kind of the first of his kind. And therefore this episode, which is mostly set in the holodeck, is still a very good episode because it deals with these issues and this science fiction idea and this morality question and all of that. So therefore I think this is a good episode. Also, it was kind of funny in places and interesting and comedic and also creepy and scary when Moriarty was taking over the ship. When I watched it as a kid, I remember it was exciting. I was on the edge of my seat, and so it's a good episode in my opinion. And Moriarty was a good villain. He was not like totally evil. He had a humanity to him. So this is an example of a good holodeck episode. It also raises a few questions about Data, which will be addressed later on in this season, about how much Data himself is a real person or not. And that's where Pulaski, I think, actually plays a good role, because she's a character who expresses that belief that some people might have, that a machine like Data would never be a real person. And that's something that was explored much better a few episodes from now, and I'll get to it. But the next episode is called The Outrageous Okana, and they introduce this character who is supposed to be, I guess, like Han Solo from Star Wars, some kind of roguish cool guy or something, but it wasn't really done that well. It's kind of laughable, but it's like unintentional comedy, so I still can enjoy this episode. It does have some funny moments, and also there are scenes of Data trying to learn humor, and not really that funny, but still kind of nice, still kind of cute scenes, and so that's why I think this episode is okay, just an average episode. And the next one is called Loud as a Whisper, which I remember I hated this episode, and that guy with the beard really annoyed me. He's kind of a mute guy who cannot talk, and he has those people who talk for him, by telepathy. And I do like the fact that they try to do something unique and original. I do like the fact that they're trying out all this weird stuff, but I just don't think it worked. I don't think it's kind of ridiculous. It doesn't work for me. I don't like this plot, and there was no real big plot. So we know that he tries to make peace between two groups of aliens, and he's also kind of like a super moral. He's like a Jesus type, a man of peace, the only one who is able to bridge the gap between those two groups or something. And it's a nice idea in theory, but in practice they didn't really do. They didn't really show why he's so smart. What did he actually do that makes him such a smart or brilliant negotiator or whatever? We don't really get any of that. We only have him coming up to Troy, trying to score with Troy, I guess, and going on a date with her. We don't really see anything about the actual dispute between the aliens. And so I don't find this episode really that interesting. It had that interesting idea of a different way of communication, but it just didn't work. It was just weird and strange. The next episode is called The Schizoid Man. I don't know how to pronounce that. And it's about Data meeting his grandfather, basically, the guy who taught his father how to do cybernetic things. I don't remember how they said it. And they had the weird stuff in the beginning about beaming out when the ship leaves. And it's always, I never understood that part. So the ship arrives, it beams them down and then leaves immediately, and then they materialize on their own. So first of all, how much time exactly did they save with all of that? Like, couldn't they just wait 5 more seconds to finish the beaming and then leave? So what was so urgent that they had to save those 5 seconds? It wasn't some battle situation or something, so it never made sense to me. And also, how exactly do they materialize on their own without the ship to do it? So I always found that bit a little bit weird and unnecessary. And then Data meets with this grandpa guy, and then that guy dies, and then later we find out he actually possessed Data. He transferred his consciousness into Data, which again is an idea that was done in a lot of other science fiction shows, which came later, but this is probably one of the first ones with this idea. I guess it was done in TOS as well a few times, but this is a nice idea, a neat idea to play with, someone who doesn't want to die, so he transfers his mind to someone else. And this episode once again gives Brent Spiner permission to act crazy and all of that, which obviously he loves doing, and that's really fun. And so this episode had a lot of funny scenes of Data acting crazy, so that was fun. And he did have that moral dilemma of Picard trying to convince that guy to let Data live, because he says Data is not simply an android, he is a person, you have no right to take that away from him. And so he manages to convince that guy in the end to release Data, basically. So I think this episode, I wouldn't say it's great, but it's above average. It's a decent, good episode with a lot of funny scenes and interesting moments. The next episode is called Unnatural Selection, in which the Enterprise meets another ship on which everybody became old and died. And that reminds me of a TOS episode in which that happened to the Enterprise. A lot of the ideas in this show, by the way, are very similar to ideas that were done in TOS. And most times it's done better here, because, you know, the visual effects are better, the acting is better, the sets are better. Except a few exceptions, maybe TNG is a much better show in a practical sense than TOS was. Of course, TOS was much more original because it was the first show to do any of these ideas, and TNG is kind of less original because it simply takes the same ideas, but it does improve upon them, and so it's like a good remake. And I'm fine with that. I'm fine with improving all their ideas. And so anyway, they meet that ship with everybody getting older there, and then Pulaski gets infected, also becomes older, and then they find out it's all the result of genetic tests that some station did on children, and they say that they created those children to be perfect, and they have all kinds of powers. They are telepathic, they have telekinesis and all kinds of powers, and they're supposedly human. And this is a very big contradiction with what was later said in Deep Space Nine, when they said that genetic engineering was forbidden ever since the eugenics wars, that it's illegal to do these kinds of improvements. And so how can we explain this episode in which apparently some station is allowed to do genetic engineering of these children, and no one even says something about that? No character says that's wrong. Picard kind of implies it's wrong. He says, when Pulaski says we may be looking at the future of humanity, then Picard says only according to the vision of that doctor who created them. So that sounded like criticism, but except for that, no one ever said that's illegal. Maybe we can assume that station did it illegally, and maybe later on, after they deal with this crisis, they'll also report them for violating the law, basically. But I wish it would have been mentioned in the actual episode, because it seems to be totally fine, like it's a normal thing to do these genetic tests. And I wish they wouldn't have said they are humans. If not for that line in which Pulaski says this is the future of humanity, then one of my excuses could have been, that these are not actually humans. Maybe these are aliens from some different planet who simply look human, but they don't have that law of against genetic engineering. Even if they are part of the Federation, maybe not all planets signed up to that law that you cannot do genetic engineering, and so I could have excused it that way. But they specifically said that they are humans, and so it's a very big problem. And that doctor did say that they're not engineered, they are created. So maybe she found some loophole to create them without using genetic engineering. Maybe they are not fully human. Maybe she kind of crossbred all kinds of aliens together to produce them because their powers seemed similar to Betazoid powers and all of that. So maybe they are not fully human. Maybe actually it's an experiment in interspecies breeding or something. And that way it doesn't really violate those laws. But they do say specifically that they gave them that advanced immune system. So that sounds like genetic engineering. So it's really hard to explain this away, except to say that maybe this is all in a different timeline. As I said in my previous video, we can explain away many inconsistencies by simply saying that because of all the time traveling which happened later, it created a new timeline in which all kinds of things are different, and so this could be one of them. And I made a whole long video just about that topic once to try to excuse all the mistakes in all of Star Trek by simply saying that the timeline keeps changing because of all the temporal violations that everybody are doing. So that's probably the best excuse to explain away all the mistakes. So what do I think about this episode? I think it's a good average episode, nothing really spectacular, nothing really amazing, but a few nice ideas, some interesting character development. Pulaski seems to be softening up to Data, suddenly they're much more friendly than before. Obviously they would have become friends later on if she would have stayed on the show. Which I kind of wish she did, because she does seem to be more interesting and more passionate. Kind of Dr. Crusher was kind of more boring as a character in my opinion. Anyway, moving on to the next episode, which is called A Matter of Honor, and this was a fun episode in which Riker goes to serve on a Klingon ship, and there was a lot of funny moments in that part of the episode. And the other part was about that alien who looks exactly like Wesley's friend from season 1, who he helped get into the academy on his own expense, and then he meets him now as an ensign, but he says that it's not the same guy. He's simply from his planet and they all look the same, I guess. Most of the episode was about Riker going to the Klingons, and also this was another chance to get to know these new Klingons who are much different from the one in the original series, so this is a good episode in that sense as well. And Riker's personality really starts to shine. As I said, in season 1 he was very boring, but now suddenly he becomes a much more interesting and charismatic character, so overall a good episode. And the next episode is called The Measure of a Man, and this is definitely the best episode of season 2 and probably one of the best episodes from the entire series, and maybe even one of the best examples of really exploring the idea of artificial intelligence from all of science fiction on television, because this whole episode was about exploring the question, is Data just a machine or does he have a soul? Does he have the right of free will like any normal person or not? And so this whole episode was dealing with this topic. It was basically a hearing to determine Data's rights, if he has the right to resign from Starfleet or is he property. As a character story it was great because you see the character of Data and how other people react to him, all the personal connections, the friendship, all of that, so that was great if we just look at the characters. And also the story itself is interesting, and also that hearing in the end of the episode was great. Like all the dialogue was really cleverly written and the acting was brilliant in this episode. I think it's one of Patrick Stewart's best performances. He was really passionate, he was really making those speeches about Data and was really so passionate about it, and that really brought it to a whole new level. The dialogue itself was very clever, but the way he delivered it is brilliant, and that instantly made him one of the best characters in all of Star Trek. You could totally buy, you could totally get into the story and you feel like it's all real and all of that, so really great performance, really great dialogue, great acting by everyone. And even though this episode didn't really have any special effects except a few practical effects like removing Data's hand and having him bend some steel and all of that, it had almost no other special effects, and still it's one of the very best episodes of the entire series because all those other factors were so well done. And so this is definitely the best in season 2 and one of the best in the whole show in my opinion. Very memorable, very emotional, very interesting, philosophical, everything you would want from a science fiction story. So a really great episode. Moving on to the next one, which is called The Dolphin. I don't know how to pronounce that, and that's about Wesley falling in love with some alien girl who turns out to be a shapeshifter, and her caretaker is also a shapeshifter, And I love that episode as a kid because, I was a kid myself, and Wesley was pretty nice in this episode. He wasn't annoying in any way, in my opinion, in this one. And it had that love story as well as that bigger science fiction idea of these shapeshifters, and especially that woman, that old lady was really funny the way that she was like super angry and stuff. She really played well, that all those scenes she was getting pissed off at something, that's really hilarious, and always turning into all kinds of monsters. And so I remember this is a very fun episode. Looking back at it now, objectively, it's not really a great episode, but when it came out it was great and it had some surprises, had a lot of funny moments, so overall a good episode in my opinion. Not the best, not great, but a very decent episode, slightly above average in my opinion. And the next episode is called Contagion, which was about the Enterprise encountering another ship, the Yamato, that had some malfunctions and blew up in the start of the episode. And then they find out it's because that ship was investigating the Iconians and it picked up some Iconian virus or something. And then the Enterprise also starts to break up, and also there was a lot of funny scenes of stuff breaking up. And Geordi gets thrown around in the turbo lift, which was funny, and a lot of kind of funny moments. And there was also that conflict with the Romulans, that they were competing with the Romulans who would find the Iconians. And then in the end, Picard finds the Iconian planet and they activate the gate, which looks really cool. Even by today's standards, I love that special effect. I love the whole idea of wormholes and all of that. So seeing those portals opening up and Data puts his hand through it, and you can see that it's like an instant, like the direct portal to other places. That's a very fun idea. And so I love that whole idea of the Iconians as an ancient culture that was wiped out. I also love the fact that Picard in one scene explains to Wesley that maybe history didn't judge those people correctly, because the ones who win the war write the history, and so maybe the Iconians were not really the bad guys. Maybe they were the victims, maybe other people feared their advanced technology and that's why they destroyed them, but maybe the Iconians actually ran away through their portals and maybe they do live somewhere. So I wish that would have been explored in future Star Trek shows some more, because I think that idea had so much potential. It's also similar to what was done on Stargate with the Ancients and all of that. So Stargate, I feel like Stargate often kind of borrows a lot of the ideas that Star Trek did, which Star Trek never really fulfilled the potential of, and then it was done on Stargate. So at least we had some of those similar kinds of ideas in Stargate, I guess. But I wish Star Trek would have done that as well. I wish it would have continued some of those seeds they planted in earlier seasons and did something with that in later shows. Deep Space Nine did have one episode about the Iconians, but not really, they didn't really add anything. They just mentioned them and showed another portal and that's it. So I wish they would have explored that some more in the rest of Star Trek. So anyway, the Enterprise is malfunctioning and then it has to deal with the Romulans with Riker in command, and that was great. And so overall a very good episode. I think this is one of the best episodes of season 2. It had a mystery, it was exciting, it had cool science fiction ideas, it had that conflict with the Romulans, so a lot of elements, a lot of good elements were all together in this episode. And even some of Picard's dialogue about the Iconians, that maybe they were not the bad guys, that's like in the Star Trek spirit of things. Like I like how in Star Trek they often say that things are not black and white. Like Picard says that maybe history misjudged the Iconians, maybe they were not the bad guys, because he sees that that room with the portals doesn't look like a room designed for wars and conflict, that maybe they were just explorers and they were misunderstood and feared and all of that. So, and I love that idea because that's like the spirit of Star Trek, the spirit of understanding, the optimistic spirit that those aliens are not evil, that they are simply misunderstood. I love that idea. That's also, I was pissed off in Deep Space Nine when they did say that the Iconians control the vast empire and all of that, so that seemed to indicate that they were the bad guys. So I much prefer the TNG style of implying that they were actually good guys. And I wish we would have actually met them in future shows. Maybe in Voyager they should have done something with that, especially with the whole wanting to go home plot and all of that. Maybe Voyager should have met an Iconian. That would have been interesting. A missed opportunity. Anyway, this was a good episode in my opinion. Moving on, the next episode is called The Royale, which was about them going down to some planet and finding a hotel that looks like in the 20th century Earth. And it kind of reminds me of the episode in TOS called A Taste of the Action, in which Kirk goes to a planet which looks like old Earth and with gangsters and all of that. So there's similar elements of it here. Also, it was all based because of a book. Someone left a book on that planet and formed that civilization. And here they say that an astronaut from Earth had that book and he was found by some aliens who wanted to make him comfortable, and so they created this simulation for him which was based off this book which they thought he liked, and apparently he actually hated that book, and so he had to live the rest of his life in that hotel, and they find his skeleton in a room, and that's kind of a creepy idea. So I love that kind of creepy horror ideas. It's like Twilight Zone, something very creepy. So that guy actually lived his whole life in the simulation, and now they find him, and now they also get trapped there. And in order to get out, they have to fulfill the last part of the book so that they'll be able to leave. So I wonder why that astronaut never tried that. I guess he needed more people. So one guy could never get out, I guess. And the episode had some funny moments with Data in the casino and all of that. So overall a good episode. And the next episode is called Time Squared, which also I remember I love this episode. The first time I saw it, it was very kind of mysterious, it was creepy, you didn't know what's going on, you didn't know how it will all end, and so it was very good on first viewing. On a repeated viewing, it's a bit less good because we never really got the full answer. We don't really know what exactly caused this whole situation, we don't know how it all started. It's not as good on a repeat viewing, but the first viewing of this episode was excellent. I remember I was really excited by it. I was really creeped out, kind of. They had all those scenes of the other Picard, and he was kind of behaving strangely. He's not fully there, like he's crazy and stuff. So it was kind of creepy, and the creepy music and everything. So it was really well done in that sense, and that whole mystery and the time loop and all of that. That was really fun. And so I actually kind of like this episode. So I think it's above average, not perfect, but I love it as kind of a creepy mystery episode. And the next episode is called the Icarus Factor, which is about Riker's dad coming to the ship, and that was pretty boring. It felt like a soap opera. It was like watching, The Bold and the Beautiful or something. So his dad comes on board, and they have these problems, and they have to talk about it, and nothing really happens in the whole episode. And it turns out he's a former boyfriend of Pulaski, which makes no sense because she never mentioned this previously. And Riker is offered his own ship, and he declines, and so the whole episode is just people talking. And they had that ridiculous fight scene in the end with those plastic costumes, which looked kind of bad. And so this is not a good episode. I would say this is one of the worst episodes of this season, and so not good. And the next episode is called Pen Pals, which was about Data making contact with some alien girl who is not supposed to be making contact with because she's in a pre-warp civilization, and he violated the Prime Directive for some reason. And then he tells Picard, and Picard is not happy about it, and that planet is about to be destroyed, and they are not allowed to intervene, which by the way is stupid. It's one of the things that pissed me off about the Prime Directive. In the original series, whenever they encounter such a situation in which the entire planet is about to be destroyed, Kirk seemed to imply that you are allowed to violate the Prime Directive under such circumstances, because nothing you would do would be worse than all those people simply dying. And so in those cases it was apparently allowed to intervene. And yet in TNG, it's implied in some episodes that you are not allowed to intervene to save a planet, even if everybody on the planet is about to die, which makes no sense to me, because the Prime Directive did make sense when it was about protecting the civilization from contamination, not to accidentally give them religion or accidentally influencing their development in a bad way and so on. But letting them all die, how can it be worse than whatever interference you will cause? So they will find out about aliens, so what, they will still be alive at least, even if they develop religion because of that or something like that. It's still better off than simply dying completely. And so that's one of the real negatives in this episode and in a few other episodes that really make me hate the whole idea of the Prime Directive. It makes no sense in cases like this. Like the Prime Directive in a lot of cases was a very good, very nice idea, but not here. And one day I will do a whole elaborate video just on this topic to really discuss it, and I think it makes sense and not to intervene politically into situations you don't know well enough. So meeting some alien planet that you don't know its full history and intervening in some kind of civil war there, that's a bad idea. Interacting with primitive people who will think you're a god, that's a bad idea. Obviously that was best shown in the episode Who Watches the Watchers in the next season. And giving advanced technology to primitive people probably wouldn't end well. And also I love the idea that the Prime Directive kind of explains why we don't meet aliens today. Like if we can imagine that we are in a universe that is like Star Trek in which there are so many aliens, how come we are never contacted by any of them? But maybe there is some kind of galactic federation with rules and all of that, and maybe they keep us isolated and safe because we are too primitive yet, and that's why no aliens are allowed to intervene on our planet. And so I love the fact that the Prime Directive kind of explains that away. It explains why we don't meet any aliens today. So that's another interesting thing about the Prime Directive, that it's like an excuse to explain away why we never met aliens in the past. Even though they kind of missed that opportunity, they really should have said that the Federation existed before Earth joined it. They kind of said that Earth is one of the founding members of it, and I think that was a big mistake. They should have said that the Federation existed even today, before Earth had the warp drive, there was already a Galactic Federation, and only later Earth joined it. And instead, they made that whole thing about Earth being the center of the Federation, which I think is a bad idea. It's also very egocentrical. It's very arrogant to say that, humans are the one who built everything. So I really dislike that idea. I wish they would have said that the Federation existed before humans even went into space, and then it would explain why we never met aliens today. But they kind of missed that opportunity. So anyway, back to this episode, Pen Pals. It did have some good scenes of them debating these issues of the Prime Directive, but I still don't like the fact that they even consider letting a whole planet die. I think it's very immoral, it's evil, and that really ruins the whole thing. But other than this part, this episode was very cute. Data always has these episodes in which he's making friends with all kinds of kids, and in some ways he's like a kid himself. He's very innocent, very pure, very good-hearted. So it's always nice to see him kind of befriending little kids. And in the end of the episode, they do save the planet. And because they didn't get punished by Starfleet, I guess Starfleet did agree that it was the right thing to do under the circumstances. So at least they did do the right thing in the end. And there were a lot of cute scenes between Data and that alien girl and all of that. So overall, an okay episode. I only wish they did the Prime Directive better. I really hated that whole part about letting them all die as an option. But that's the only negative thing I can say about the episode. And the next episode is called Q Who, which was the first episode about the Borg. And the Borg were very cool and creepy villains before they were ruined in all their reappearances in later shows, especially in Voyager, which made the Borg much weaker, and also they kind of ditched the whole collective thing and instead made them an army of zombies enslaved to a queen, which kind of ruined the whole idea of it. And also in this episode they say the Borg don't have any genders, that they kind of remove their genders whenever they remove parts of their body to become drones, and also they imply that the Borg actually reproduce by themselves. They have babies and then they start turning the babies immediately into cyborgs, and all of it was so creepy, or their ship was so creepy, and I love that creepiness of all of it. So this was a very good episode, establishing one of the best villains in all of Star Trek, who are also a very interesting science fiction idea, the whole idea of the collective. I really wish they would have exploited this potential much better. They could have done it so much better. Maybe they will do that finally in the new Picard show, maybe do a proper Borg story, and not the kind of nonsense they did in Voyager and so on. So this was a very good episode, one of the best in season 2, and one of the most important episodes in the entire series. And the next episode is called Samarian Snare, which was about Picard going to get a heart surgery, which was not that interesting. I guess it was interesting to put him together with Wesley because they were kind of having a strained relationship, and so that was an opportunity to get these two characters talking alone and all of that. But the whole surgery stuff, was that really supposed to be tenseful? Would we really assume that Picard might die so early in the series? And so this was not really any kind of tenseful situation, so it's just a waste of time. And the other plot is about the Enterprise without Picard encountering the Packleds, who I do think are very funny species, kind of villains, but more of a comic relief, kind of like the Ferengi in some ways, kind of silly aliens. And I did like that idea of them pretending to be so helpless, so that the Enterprise will try to help them and then betray the Enterprise and try to keep Geordi, and they try to ransom him for information from the Enterprise. So I thought the Packleds were kind of funny villains. It's a shame we didn't see them again. We only saw glimpses of them in some Deep Space Nine episodes, I think, but we never really had more Packled characters. They kind of gave all of that kind of comic relief ideas to the Ferengi. Anytime they wanted to have like an annoying alien or a stupid alien, it was usually the Ferengi after this. So I would say this is a slightly below average episode. And the next episode is called Up the Long Ladder, and it had a few different ideas kind of meshed together. One of them was encountering a planet which had a population of clones of only 5 people who were scientists who crashed on that planet, and because they didn't have enough people to reproduce, they decided to clone themselves, and now it's a whole civilization of clones. And of course the white man is the leader caste, and all those black guys appear to be only the guards and manual labor and stuff like that, which I guess is kind of a racist idea, but maybe it was just a coincidence. And later they also meet a group from another planet who seem to be kind of primitive, kind of like farmers, and then in the end they hook them up together so that they can solve both of their problems simultaneously. Kind of a funny episode. It did have some nice moments. I would say it's an average episode, not great, not terrible. And the next episode is Manhunt, which I thought was a very nice comedy episode, the one about Loxana looking for a husband, and she has the hots for Picard, and Picard is hiding in the holodeck. Another example of a good use of a holodeck for simply a comedic scene. and not the whole episode in the holodeck. No one is stuck in the holodeck, he's simply hiding there from Loxana Troy, and then she wants to marry Riker. And also those fish guys, probably my favorite alien, the funniest aliens I've ever seen, were those two fish guys, especially when they were eating their food. That was just so hilarious, one of the funniest moments in the entire show in my opinion. And so I would say this is a good episode, a good comedy, light-hearted episode, not taking itself too seriously, being kind of all just for fun, for a comedy. So this is the perfect kind of episode to just sit back and relax and have a laugh and just have good fun. And so I would say this is one of the best episodes in season 2. And Loxana was pretty fun in this one. She wasn't as funny previously or after. I think this is probably one of the best episodes for Loxana Troy, really where she's the funniest. And so I would say this is a good episode. And the next episode is called The Emissary, which was about the ex-girlfriend of Worf who comes to the Enterprise to warn them from a ship of Klingons from the past, from the time when they were still at war with the Federation. And strangely, they look exactly like today's Klingons with foreheads and everything, even though they supposedly come from the time of TOS or the time of Star Trek Discovery. So shouldn't they look either not with foreheads or look like orcs? But for some reason they look exactly like the Klingons in TNG and onwards. And Keller is sent to the Enterprise to warn them from these Klingons, and then she has a thing with Worf, and then they do something in the holodeck, they hold hands, and then Alexander is born a year later. So I guess holding hands and scratching each other's hands gets Klingons pregnant. So I think this was a slightly below average episode, even though Keller is an awesome character. I really liked her, I wish she was in more episodes, and that she wouldn't die so quickly in the next appearance. But the episode itself was not that impressive from what I remember, so slightly below average. And the next episode is called Peak Performance, which is about Riker getting his own ship only to fight the Enterprise. And it had that annoying alien that actor played in Total Recall. I recently made a parody of that, mashing everything together, so that was kind of funny. And that whole battle between Riker and Picard, it was not really that impressive. Even back when it aired, it was not really spectacular in any way. And then the Ferengi show up to cause trouble, and that alien is playing against Data, and Data loses confidence in himself because he loses to him. And then Picard has to talk with him, and he has a good line. I think he said that it's possible to make no mistakes and still lose. That's not a flaw, that's being human, something like that. And then Data regained his confidence. So this episode had some good moments, but overall I would say it's a below average episode, nothing really that impressive. And the next episode is called Shades of Grey, and it's basically just a clip show. They simply show all the explosions or all the cool moments from this season and the previous season, and that's it. Very little new stuff. They only kind of make up that whole plot of Riker being infected by something, and then to cure him they have to stimulate his memories, and then we see his memories of basically all the best scenes from the previous episodes. And because it was only 2 seasons, there was not that many to pick from. So basically anytime there's any kind of explosion or something cool like that, then they show it in this clip show, and that's it. So that's the whole episode. So definitely a weak episode with very little new material and a kind of weak plot to connect it all. But it did have a few funny moments and so on, so I can't say I hate this. I think this was done to save money because I didn't have enough money to complete the season. So obviously very little new material in this episode, and that's probably why this is the worst episode of the season. Simply has less substance. So that's it for season 2. So my favorite episodes were Where Silence Has Liz, Elementary Dear Data, The Measure of a Man, probably the best episode, Contagion, also a good episode, Times Squared, I would say is a good episode, Q Who is a good and important episode, Manhunt was a funny episode. So those are my favorite episodes in this season, and the absolute best was Measure of a Man, which will probably be one of my top episodes of the entire show. So that's it for now, and I will review season 3 in my next video. So let me know what you think in the comments below, and we can discuss it in the comment section, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.